Blood stained Silas Finch's left cuff as he gripped a half-finished letter, a promise inked in a dying man's hand. Beyond the saloon doors, rolling thunder pressed over the Wyoming horizon, as if the very skies braced for a final showdown. In that taut silence before violence struck, only one truth burned bright. A broken vow could shatter more than hearts, it might destroy what hope remained. The wind hissed across the plains, brushing tall sage and stirring clouds of golden dust. The new railroad glinted in the sun, though it still stretched only so far across the unsettled frontier. In the distance, the jagged peaks of the Bighorn Mountains rose like silent sentinels, keeping their centuries-old watch. Half a mile from the fledgling town of Breaksall Fork stood a modest homestead, battered fence leaned to stable, and a single-room cabin. Silence reigned there, broken only by the shuffle of worn boots on dirt. Those boots belonged to Silas Finch, a man hardened by war, betrayal, and the daily fight for survival on the frontier. At first glance he was unremarkable, a lean figure in a long duster, face roughened by the Wyoming sun. But for the black patch he wore over his right eye, where his eye once shone with restless ambition, now only scar tissue remained, a testament to a bullet that had forever changed his path. Silas's goal in life was simple: to earn enough money to buy out the land he'd been working and prove to himself, and the ghosts of his past, that he wasn't simply drifting. Survival had been his trade since the day he left the cavalry. But deeper than that lay a desperate want for belonging. Having lost so many to war and disease, Silas feared he might never again know the warmth of a family's embrace or the sweet calm of being needed. His greatest fear, though, was that his nightmares would catch him unprepared, that one day the savage memory of losing his fellow soldiers would devour him from within. In the hush of night, when the wind moaned in lonely hollows, Silas still heard the crack of rifles, the screams of men, and sometimes he woke drenched in sweat, half believing the man who'd cost him his right eye still lurked outside his window. Not a half-mile away, along a rutted trail leading into Breaksall Fork, rode a lone figure on a tired mule. Willa Rose Thompson, just 13 summers old, was orphaned when smallpox claimed her mother and father a winter ago. An aunt in Tennessee took her in for a brief while, but when family funds ran scarce, Willa was left with no better recourse than to follow faint clues from an old trunk. There, she found a letter penned by her father that mentioned a certain Silas Finch, a man who, according to the letter, had once served in the cavalry with him and made a promise sealed by handshakes and tears that if tragedy fell upon the Thompson family, Silas would care for the child left behind, as if she were blood of your blood. But the letter in Willa's shaky grip was unfinished. A spatter of her father's blood marred the final sentences, where he'd begun to outline some arrangement, some vow of guardianship, perhaps. In her young mind, it had taken on mythical importance. If she could only find this one-eyed cowboy her father named, perhaps the gaping hole of loneliness in her life would be filled. Perhaps she wouldn't have to wander from place to place, uncertain of tomorrow. Yet Willa was no shrinking violet. Beneath her quiet exterior, she guarded a fierce resolve and a raw, throbbing itch to be recognized, not as some broken child in need of pity, but as a person with her own dreams and value. She longed to work the land or handle ranch animals. She cared little for city airs or polite society. The West, for all its brutality, offered a freedom her soul craved. Her greatest fear was rejection. She had nothing to give but her own 2 hands and a battered trunk of memories. If Silas Finch turned her away, she had nowhere else to go. Fate would have its say soon enough. That same afternoon, the dust rose on the main road into Breaksall Fork as Willa's mule stumbled toward the homestead. In the distance, she spotted the solitary figure closing a gate. Even from afar, she noticed the ragged black patch and felt her stomach tighten with anxious hope. This had to be the man, Silas Finch, the one-eyed cowboy who, according to her father's letter, owed her his protection. But inside Silas's heart beat a very different rhythm. He had no notion of the promise he'd apparently made to Willa's father. Yes, he remembered a comrade named Thompson, a man he'd fought alongside during the cavalry's most harrowing nights. And yes, Thompson's last words, spoken in pained gasps after a devastating ambush, were something akin to a half-choked request for help. Silas recalled pressing a canteen to the dying man's lips and hearing, "My Willa, take care off." But in the chaos of that moment, bullets whizzing overhead, and the bitter stench of gun smoke, those words had faded into the screams of the wounded. Silas had never known if Thompson survived. He'd never received an official letter, nor did he truly believe he could keep that final promise if the chance arose. He had been too broken, too battered himself. Now, as Willa Rose approached, Silas's lone gray eye flickered with caution. The child's clothes were threadbare, face smudged with dust from the trail, yet the determination in her blue eyes struck him as something he recognized, that stubborn hope in the face of despair. He swallowed, not knowing that her very presence would unravel the life he had painfully stitched together. Standing before him, Willa clutched her father's battered letter. "This here says," she faltered, voice trembling from exhaustion and raw nerves, "that you made a promise. My pa's name was Henry Thompson. We rode together. So it says." Silas's heart sank. His memory of Henry Thompson was of a courageous soldier who once shielded him from a sniper's bullet. Silas had not escaped unscathed, but Thompson had ensured that bullet hit only his eye, not his brain. The pity was that Thompson's own road led to a slow, agonizing death from smallpox if Willa's story was true. She held out the letter. The final line smudged by tears and time, "Read I should anything befall me, I leave Willa in your custody. I know you to be a man of your word. Should she come to you, show her the kindness." Words ended there, a splatter of red marking the page. Silas's throat tightened. I did owe your father a debt." Even as he said this, a whirlwind of questions spun in his mind. He wasn't equipped to care for a child. His meager homestead hardly fed one mouth, let alone two, but to turn her away, he couldn't stomach the thought. Not after everything he owed Henry Thompson. And so their fates, bound by a half-finished letter, set in motion a story that would carry them across perilous terrain, into the searing underbelly of guilt and longing, and toward a moment of reckoning neither could imagine. Willa slept on a makeshift cot in Silas's cabin. She rose at dawn, slipped out quietly, and tried to prove her worth fetching water from the nearby creek, gathering what meager vegetables grew in the scraggly patch behind the cabin, and cooking a small pot of beans. Silas watched, uncertain how to bridge the gap between them. He admired her grit. Yet in the quiet hours, doubt gnawed at him. He was no father. He could barely keep himself afloat, let alone a child. Nevertheless, something like pride sparked in him when she scowled at the weeds choking out the garden and tore them up with a vengeance. In the town of Breaksall Fork, rumors flew. Folks wondered why the reclusive one-eyed cowboy had taken in a young girl. Some reckoned she must be the child of a war buddy. Others gossiped that maybe she was his own child by some woman long gone. A few whispered about scandal. Silas, to his credit, kept his head down, but suspicion had a way of festering in small frontier towns, and Willa sensed the tension whenever they went in to purchase supplies. It was nearly dusk when Silas and Willa finished dinner. Hardtack softened with stew. Outside, the wind tore at the eaves, moaning around the corners of the cabin like a restless spirit. Silas cleared his throat and tried to explain. "Willa, your father was the bravest man I ever served with. He saved my life twice, in fact, and I believe I owe him a debt. But what I have to offer ain't much." Willa set her spoon down, meeting his gaze. "I can work. I can ride. I can learn to shoot if I have to." Silas's single eye softened. "I see that. But we don't even own this land outright yet. I've been paying installments to Mr. Schofield, the banker in town. With the railroad coming through, that land might soon be worth a fortune, or it might be seized for some new scheme. Nothing's certain." A brief silence. Finally, Willa reached into her satchel and produced the letter. Her small hand smoothed the wrinkled paper. "It's not just a promise to look after me." She hesitated, tears threatening to surface. Somewhere in here. My father wrote about a marriage pact. The words nearly choked her, but she pressed on. He said if all else fails, if a man with a good heart were to vow to keep me safer, I would do the same in return. It's old tradition, I guess, from my mother's side. But the letter's unfinished, so I don't know how it's supposed to go. The shock that flashed across Silas's face was undeniable. Marriage pact? Willa, you're just a child. You're not old enough. I know, she cut in, cheeks flushed. But my father believed in the sanctity of promises. And sometimes out in the West, things ain't cut and dried the way folks in big cities might think. Maybe it ain't about a real marriage in a preacher's sense, but a vow. A vow that ties two souls together, so neither one is alone. Silas felt a lump lodge in his throat. The notion was absurd, yet heartbreakingly earnest. He recalled a conversation with Henry Thompson, a year before the ambush that cost them both so dearly. Henry had joked about an old Thompson family pledge, one that in dire times had bound orphaned kin to protectors by a vow that resembled marriage, but was really more of a guardianship sealed by mutual promise. Silas had laughed it off then. Who would ever expect such a tradition to surface in real life? And yet here was Henry's daughter, alone in the world, with only an unfinished letter urging her to seek protection from a man who once swore to repay a debt. Silas took a long breath. Willa, let's not speak more of it tonight. Let's figure out a better solution. She nodded, but the letter lay between them like a silent witness to Henry Thompson's final request. Morning arrived with a biting chill. Silas decided to head into Breaksall Fork for feed and fresh supplies. Willa insisted on joining him. Though he had his reservations, he couldn't deny she handled a horse better than most grown men. So they hitched up Silas's old mare, Daisy, alongside the new pony Silas had borrowed money to buy. Halfway to town, they skirted a rocky canyon where the wind snaked in eerie echoes. Silas noted the hush of birds, the tension in the horse's gait. "Stay alert," he whispered to Willa. "Something's off." Before they could react, 3 riders emerged from behind a crooked pine. Outlaws by the look of them, dusty bandanas over their faces, revolvers drawn. Silas's heart hammered. His right hand hovered near his holster, while his left tightened on the reins. One of the outlaws barked, "Throw down your guns and your money, or we'll shoot." A swirl of fear coiled in Willa's belly, but she forced herself to remain calm. She recalled a single shooting lesson Silas had given her 2 days ago. How to grip the revolver, how to line up the sights. Silas locked his gaze on the man who spoke. "We got nothing worth your trouble. Ain't that so?" The outlaw smirked. "I see a fine mare, a decent pony, and maybe that patch of land you call a ranch. Word is you owe money to Schofield. Maybe you can repay us too, or we'll take that little girl off your hands." Willa's breath caught in her throat. Her mind reeled with terror, then rage. Silas inched his hand toward the revolver hidden beneath the saddle bag. Time seemed to slow. The second outlaw's finger twitched on the trigger. A heartbeat later, Silas drew his gun. Shots cracked, echoing down the canyon. Willa yanked her reins, pressing her pony back out of harm's way. A bullet ripped through Silas's coat, grazing his shoulder. Another whistled past Willa's ear. She barely heard the curse that flew from Silas's lips as he fired once, twice. One outlaw tumbled from his horse, clutching his arm. The other 2 spurred their mounts forward, circling around in a flurry of dust. Silas swung Daisy around, forcing them to back off or collide. In the haze, Willa caught sight of the fallen outlaw struggling to raise his pistol. On a desperate impulse, she slid off her pony, picking up the revolver Silas had gifted her. Hands trembling, she aimed and shouted, "Don't move!" Her voice cracked, uncertain. The man sneered, blood staining the shoulder of his coat. He fired a wild shot at her, the bullet ricocheting off a nearby rock. She squeezed the trigger. The recoil kicked her arm back, and the shot went wide. Another moment's chaos, and Silas arrived with a blow to the man's head, knocking him out cold. The other 2, Seeing their companion down and a half-crazed one-eyed cowboy prepared to fight to the death fled. Their hoofbeats thundered across the canyon floor. Panting, Silas glanced at Willa. Her eyes were wide, tears welling at the corners, though her jaw was set firm. He realized then how raw and close to the brink she was. This was no life for a child. Yet here she stood, unflinching in the dust and blood. He pressed a hand to his wounded shoulder. "You all right?" She managed a nod, exhaling shakily. I'm fine." Then she looked at the unconscious outlaw. "What do we do with him?" Silas's gaze was grim. "We'll hogtie him and bring him into town. Let the law handle it." They did just that. With ropes and curses, they secured the man across his own horse and made their way to Breaksall Fork. The entire ordeal left them trembling and exhausted, but a quiet triumph also pulsed between them. They had survived, a bond forged in gunpowder and fear. At the Breaksall Fork sheriff's office, Silas turned over the outlaw while Willa stood quietly by, too shaken to speak. The sheriff, a burly man named Pearson, grunted his thanks and promised to look out for accomplices. Then, noticing Willa's condition, he asked if everything was all right at home. Silas cast a glance at Willa, then murmured something about it being a delicate situation. Pearson gave a knowing nod. Local rumor had preceded them. It was no secret Silas had an orphan living with him. Just as they were leaving, the town clerk, a mild-mannered man named Enoch Wright, flagged Silas down. "Got a letter for you, Mr. Finch. Came by stagecoach from out east." Silas frowned, rarely receiving mail. He took the envelope and stuffed it into his coat pocket, not giving it much thought until they were home. Night found them wary, but after they'd patched Silas's wound and eaten a hasty supper, Willa asked, "What about that letter you got?" Silas shrugged, producing the envelope. He broke the seal under lamplight. The letter was from an attorney in St. Louis, referencing Henry Thompson's last known will and testament. It seemed the old cavalry soldier had set aside a small plot of land in the Dakota Territory, near the Black Hills, rumored to be flush with gold. According to the letter, if Willa was still alive and found her father's designated guardian, Silas Finch, then guardianship was indeed to be formalized. Moreover, if by her 16th birthday Willa was not properly settled with family, the will stipulated a more binding arrangement. The attorney used archaic language, but it was clear Henry had left instructions that if Willa could not be protected by kin, Silas was to assume full responsibility, an arrangement that, if necessary, could be ratified by a vow akin to marriage, but in practice was more of a legal means to ensure she was not cast to the wolves. Silas's face paled as he read the final lines. His eye flicked to Willa. She read them too, leaning over his arm. Silence filled the room. "Why would your father do this?" Silas muttered. "I guess he knew better than most what it means to have no one." Willa whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "He grew up orphaned, too. I reckon he didn't want me to end up like him." Silas's mind reeled. The notion of being legally bound to this child was dizzying. Yet how could he deny that Henry Thompson had saved him, had believed in him? Could he simply walk away from that debt now? Willa gazed at him with a mix of fear and hope. "Does this mean I can stay?" Silas swallowed. "For now," he said softly, resting a calloused hand on her shoulder. "Yes, you can stay. But we'll talk about the rest when the time is right." The next days passed in a flurry. Repairs on the ranch, errands in town, wary glances at every unknown rider on the horizon. The quiet nights brought uneasy dreams. Silas found himself sifting through memories of Henry. The battlefield, the rides under starlit skies, the quiet promise about Willa. He tried to push thoughts of a binding vow aside, but they crept back, haunting him. Word reached Silas that the men who ambushed him were part of a larger gang, known to harass ranchers for protection money. Tensions in Breaksall Fork ran high. Meanwhile, the local banker, Mr. Schofield, pressured Silas for overdue payments. "That land of yours is on prime territory, Finch," he'd say, mustache bristling. "The railroad might turn it into a gold mine, or you might lose it to back taxes. A wise man would sell while he can." Silas refused to sell, though he had barely enough coin to keep afloat. A friend in town, Harriet Malloy, offered a small loan, but even that wouldn't cover everything. One afternoon, Silas and Willa arrived in town to see a crowd gathered near the saloon. Inside, at a corner table, sat Schofield and a tall stranger whose gun belt sagged with menace. They called Silas over. "This here is Ward Cassidy," Schofield introduced. "He's a speculator with big plans for this region. He's got interest in your land." "Finch," Silas bristled, nodding a curt greeting. Cassidy's cold eyes flicked to Willa, then back to Silas. He offered a tight smile. "Heard you're behind on payments. If you sign over the deed, we can settle your debt. Maybe throw in a small bonus." Willa felt her pulse hammer. If Silas lost the land, where would they go? Wasn't the entire purpose of her father's arrangement to secure some semblance of stability? Silas glanced to the letter from the attorney, folded in his coat pocket. Cassidy's expression suggested a man not used to hearing no. Silas understood he was dealing with a threat as much as an offer. "I'm not interested, Cassidy," Silas said evenly, ignoring the flicker of anger in the man's eyes. "Come on, Willa." They turned to leave. Behind them, Schofield muttered, "You're making a mistake, Finch. Don't come crying to me when it's too late." Outside, Willa glared at Silas. "We can't lose the ranch. It's all we have. But how are we going to pay Schofield?" Silas let out a slow breath. "I don't know yet." That night, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and silence draped the homestead, betrayal snuck in. A single shot rang out, shattering the window. A second bullet lodged in the doorframe. Silas dragged Willa to the floor, heart pounding. Through the broken window, he glimpsed two shadowy riders galloping off into the darkness. At dawn, he found a note pinned to the barn door sill. Now, fear twisted in Silas's gut, stoking the protective anger that flared in him. He loaded his rifle. Willa tried to hide her trembling hands as she helped gather supplies. Silas was certain Cassidy or his men were behind this intimidation. Willa's voice quavered. "Maybe we should go to that land in the Dakotas. The one my pa left. Maybe we can hide out there." He took a while to answer, eyes scanning the horizon. Finally, he nodded. "It might be best. We can come back when it's safe, or when we have the money to pay Schofield off." And so they prepared to leave. The ranch had been Silas's dream, but it was built on shifting sands of debt and threat. Now, the only path that offered a glimmer of hope was the promise Henry had left in that letter. A claim to a small plot near the Black Hills, ironically the new gold rush region. If luck favored them, they could find some measure of prosperity there. Or at least peace. They set out with minimal belongings, a wagon for their supplies and rifles close at hand. The dusty trail stretched for miles through open plains, crossing streams and rocky ridges. Willa rode with a sense of both dread and anticipation. Silas's eyes scanned every ridge for signs of pursuit. They stopped near a wide river that cut through the plains. The waters ran swift and cold, snowmelt from distant mountains. A single rickety ferry offered passage. Nearby, a scattering of tents formed a temporary settlement of travelers awaiting dawn to cross. Silas found a small spot to make camp. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the musk of wet earth. Firelight danced on Willa's face as she stared at the unfinished letter in her hands. She spoke quietly. "Mr. Finch, do you think my pa was right to put all this weight on your shoulders? This vow." Silas's mouth twisted into a grim smile. "I think he believed I was a better man than I probably am. But I can't run from it." He looked at the small flame licking at the kindling. "You deserve a chance at a future, Willa. If that means we bind ourselves by some vow, maybe that's what has to happen. At least until you're of age and can choose for yourself." A tear slid down her cheek, reflecting the firelight. "I'm scared," she admitted. "But I'm trying not to be." Silas reached out a hand, gently patting her arm. "You're a brave girl. Braver than most adults I've known." She clutched the letter and nodded, resolute. By first light, travelers lined up their wagons, horses, and mules for the ferry crossing. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, tinged pink and gold. Silas and Willa waited their turn, tension gnawing at them, both from the threat of Cassidy's men and the fearsome challenge of forging a new life. Out of the corner of his eye, Silas spotted a lone rider arriving at a hard gallop, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a black coat, his horse slick with sweat. Silas felt his gut lurch. It was Ward Cassidy. Behind him, 2 more riders approached. Willa hissed, "They found us." Silas tensed. The ferry operator waved him forward, urging him to board. But the distance between them and the ferry ramp was too great. Cassidy blocked their path, the other 2 riders fanning out. Cassidy's voice boomed. "You're not going anywhere, Finch." His eyes drifted to Willa, a sinister gleam there. "I'll be taking what I'm owed, one way or another." Silas eased his rifle forward. "We owe you nothing." Cassidy's lip curled. "You owe Schofield, which means you owe me." He reached into his coat, producing a piece of paper. "I bought your debt." A humorless laugh escaped him. "So the ranch is mine now, and I'll have that land Henry Thompson left behind too, once I rid the world of you." Without warning, Cassidy's revolver flashed. A bullet whizzed past Silas, lodging in the wagon's seat. Horses whinnied, frightened. Other travelers scattered, shouts ringing across the bank. Silas dove behind the wagon, pulling Willa down. Gunfire erupted from the other 2 riders, bullets chipping the wooden wheels. Adrenaline surged in Silas's veins. He peered around the wagon, returning fire with measured shots. Willa huddled low, face pale. The ferry operator started to pull away, wanting no part of the battle. Time was running out. If they couldn't drive Cassidy off, they'd be stranded. In a lull of shots, Cassidy called out, "Hand over the girl, Finch! Then maybe I'll show mercy." Silas's blood turned to ice. His voice roared back, "Never." He signaled to Willa to crawl toward the horse. "Unhitch Daisy. We're riding out." Willa's heart hammered. She crawled through the dust, working the knots with shaking hands. Another volley of shots rang out. Silas fired back, determined to protect the one person in the world he still owed a chance at life. Suddenly, a bullet tore into Silas's leg. He gasped, falling to his side. Cassidy whooped triumphantly, urging his horse forward. Silas tried to raise his rifle but found his strength faltering. Willa saw Cassidy closing in. In that moment, she recalled her father's final instructions, the vow that hovered between them. She scrambled to Silas's side, face streaked with sweat and dirt. Her small hand gripped his, trembling but resolute. "We'll make the vow," she whispered, tears burning her eyes. "Right now. So we're bound, and neither of us can give up." Confusion warred with pain in Silas's eye, but he understood the meaning. If Henry's vow was sealed, perhaps it would give them the final push to survive, or at least to stand together, come what may. She squeezed his hand, reciting words from memory. Fragments of her father's stories. "I, Willa Rose Thompson, vow to stand by you, Silas Finch, as my guardian and protector, to share your burdens and never abandon you. In sickness and danger, in the loneliness of the frontier. Let this bind us like family." Silas's vision blurred, but he mustered a raspy breath. "I, Silas Finch, vow to keep you safe, Willa Rose Thompson, to guide you, shield you, and honor the memory of Henry Thompson until my last breath." They sealed it with a trembling handclasp, an improvised ritual, but in that moment it burned with conviction. Cassidy's horse thundered closer. Silas grit his teeth against the pain in his leg, lifting the rifle once more. He steadied his aim, prayed for Henry's spirit to guide his bullet. Cassidy leveled his revolver. 2 guns aimed at each other's hearts. A single shot tore through the air. Cassidy's eyes went wide. He toppled backward, falling from the saddle into the dust, blood blooming across his chest. Silas's shot had struck true. The other 2 riders, seeing their leader down, hesitated. One kicked his horse into a gallop, fleeing. The second fired a last desperate round at Silas, but missed wide. He followed suit, disappearing across the plains. Smoke curled from the barrel of Silas's rifle. The clang of the ferry's bell broke the stunned silence. Willa threw her arms around Silas's shoulders, tears flowing freely. He let his rifle slide to the ground, exhausted. In that moment, the vow felt not like an unwanted burden but a lifeline. The ferry operator, cursing about bullet holes in his hull, reluctantly returned to the bank. Several onlookers rushed to aid Silas. One man, a traveling doctor, helped bind the bullet wound in Silas's leg. Though the injury was painful, it seemed he would survive. As the wagon rolled onto the ferry, Cassidy lay motionless in the dust, his black coat fluttering in the wind. Perhaps the law would sort out the aftermath, but for Silas and Willa, the message was clear: they had escaped the immediate threat, bound now by an oath that turned out to be their salvation. The crossing was tense but uneventful. Once on the other side, Silas and Willa continued their journey toward Dakota territory. Their pace slowed because of Silas's leg, but they pressed on. Nights around the campfire grew quieter, the weight of the vow sinking in. In the weeks that followed, they reached the small plot Henry Thompson had left. It was less than grand, a modest stretch of land in a valley near the Black Hills. But the soil felt ripe, the water from a nearby creek flowed clear, and the pines offered shelter from the biting prairie wind. They built a humble shack. Silas's leg healed slowly, leaving a new scar to match the one behind his patch. Willa learned to hunt small game, to gather wild berries and mushrooms, and to tend a small vegetable garden. She grew taller under the bright Dakota sun, her shoulders stronger, her eyes more guarded yet still shimmering with that fierce hope. Months passed. Each day they shaped a new life out of the wilderness. Letters from Breaksall Fork reported that Cassidy's death had freed Silas from the debt, but rumors persisted that other speculators might come knocking. Still, for now they were safe. The vow that bound them as husband and wife, in a technical sense, was never fully consummated in the conventional way. Rather, it was a partnership, a guardianship that ensured Willa had a stable home. If one day she chose a real husband of her own age, Silas would yield that place. But until then, they walked side by side, forging a quiet respect and loyalty neither had known before. Sometimes, when dusk blanketed the valley and the morning doves sang a forlorn tune, Silas would recall Henry Thompson's sacrifice. He'd close his eye and imagine the cavalry days, a bullet whizzing past, Henry knocking him aside, saving his life. Now, Silas was the one ensuring Henry's daughter had a chance. In a rough-hewn desk, Willa kept the unfinished letter. Next to it lay the vows they had scrawled on a scrap of paper, words that might one day free them both from the ghosts of the past. Life was never easy. Storms battered the shack, scarcity of money forced them to trap for fur and ration their supplies. But they endured, together. In the harsh loneliness of the frontier, promises can weigh as heavy as an iron shackle or stand as strong as the backbone of a mountain. The one-eyed cowboy and the orphan girl discovered that a simple vow, born of love, sacrifice, and duty, has the power to save a soul from despair. Mercy and loyalty, once bound by ink on paper, became the bedrock upon which two wounded hearts built a shared future. No matter how fierce the storms of life rage, a steadfast promise can light the darkest hour. For in the end, it is not the letter of the law, but the bond of devotion that truly matters. Thank you for joining us on this journey across the Wyoming plains and into the Dakota wilds. If this story of grit, sacrifice, and unbreakable vows moved you, please consider giving it a like, subscribing for more tales of the untamed West, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps these frontier stories alive, so saddle up and let's ride onward together.